BioSocial. Desculpem, apareceu-me aqui uma mensagem. Peço desculpa. Então, estava eu a dizer, bem-vindos à segunda sessão das BioSocial Talks. Esta é uma iniciativa do Centro de Investigação em Antropologia e Saúde e tem como objetivo trazer a público uma série de palestras sobre abordagens antropológicas à saúde, à doença, a diferentes modos de vida e à diversidade humana, tanto em sociedades do passado quanto em sociedades atuais. Assim, vamos ter até julho, até ao dia 7 de julho, palestras sobre temas tão diversos como a antropologia dentária, os efeitos da violência no desenvolvimento infantil, que é o tema de hoje, a malária, e terminamos com uma área que eu não sei se corretamente designei por ecologia do saneamento. Obrigada por estarem desse lado do ecrã. Vamos esperar que a próxima organização de palestra já seja ao vivo, mas não sei. E muito obrigada aos colegas que fizeram os convites, aos vários investigadores que nos vão apresentar, alguns deles o resultado das suas investigações e outros as suas reflexões também sobre os temas que irão apresentar. Quero também novamente agradecer ao Vítor e à Daniela pelas questões mais práticas e administrativas da organização destas palestras. Agora eu vou dizer a mesma coisa em inglês. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of BioSocial Talks. This is the CS initiative to bring to the public a series of lectures on anthropological approaches to health, disease, different ways of life, and human diversity in both past and living populations. So we will have until the 7th of July lectures on topics as diverse as dental anthropology, the effects of violence on child development, malaria, and we end with an area that I designate, I don't know whether it is correct or not, ecology of sanitation. So thank you for being on that side of the screen. I hope in the next sessions, maybe at the end of the year, we can have this kind of presentations in place, but we don't know. And I would like to thank my colleagues who did these invitations, especially Vitor Matos and Daniela Rodrigues for the arrangements of the practical and bureaucratic questions. And now I give the floor to Daniela so she can introduce our professor, well-known professor, Barry Bogin, also our friend. And after his presentation, we will still have the opportunity to have some time for discussion if he agrees. And I hope that from these sections, new ideas for the future will emerge. So many thanks. Daniela, please.
So hi everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm especially thankful to Professor Barry Bogin for accepting my invitation to participate in this BioSocial talk. Barry Bogin is a professor emeritus of biological anthropology, first from the University of Michigan, Dearborn, and in the United States, and more recently from the Loughborough University in the UK. However, being retired only means that he now has more time to focus on some of his favorite things. And one of them is trying to understand why people grow up in such a strange way. So Professor Bogin has expertise in nutritional ecology, evolutionary biology, and human adaptation. And I have to highlight 2 lines of his research. The first one is his huge contributions to the study of human physical growth and development with the theories of origins of human childhood. And the second line is his work with the Maya people. Professor Bogin began research on Guatemalan Maya children and his families in 1974 and has continued since. His work has been of much importance, particularly for anthropologists and human biologists all over the world, and he has authored more than 200 books, papers, book chapters, and popular essays. And some of these books are essential readings, such as Human Biology, an Evolutionary and Biocultural Approach, as well as the book Patterns of Human Growth that it's now in its 3rd edition that was just published this year. I personally met Professor Bogin when he was an invited professor at the University of Coimbra. This was something like 10 years ago. And then I had the opportunity to work with him for a brief period of time when I visited the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at the Loughborough University. It was an amazing experience and I hope to come back someday. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce his talk, Fear, Violence, Inequality and Stunting in Guatemala, which is related with an article that I believe will be published very soon. And he will show us the many aspects of the social, emotional, political, and economic factors that influence human growth. And I think that he will also mention the impacts of toxic stress on fatness and obesity. So, well, the stage, or should I say, the Zoom is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much,
You're welcome.
Daniela and Christina, and all of you for being here today. It's really a great pleasure. Of course, I prefer to be in Coimbra, enjoying Portuguese food and Portuguese friends, but what can I do? Anyway, I'm going to share my screen with you. Can I do that? Let's see. No. The host has to enable me to share my screen. So I guess that's Daniela. Just let me know when you. So.
Barry, I see you need to do that.
Oh,
Not Daniela.
no, I've done it now. I've
Okay.
done it. I can do it now. Yeah. There. Can you see?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
That's good. Thanks.
Good. So you see my title, Fear,
Yes.
Violence, Inequality, and Stunting in Guatemala. Very good. Many people have helped with this. One person who's helped me is in our audience today. That's Dr. Noel Solomons, who probably knows a lot more about Guatemala and fear and violence than I do, because Dr. Solomons has lived in Guatemala how many years? A long time. We'll just leave it at that. And we'll talk with Dr. Solomons perhaps later. So let's see how we go here. Okay. I just found this quote today from a woman, a Mayan woman named Doña Petrona from the village of Xecaj, Guatemala. It was in an article published by an American anthropologist in 1994. And Doña Petrona says, people want the right to survive, to live without fear. So this is the theme that's going to go right through my talk. The article is by Linda Green, and you can find it online. Okay, before we talk about Guatemala or fear or violence, let's talk about stunting a little bit. The World Health Organization, which everybody knows about these days, defines stunting as, and I quote, impaired growth, development that children experience from poor nutrition, repeated infection, and or really inadequate social stimulation. So starting with the last one, if children are not cared for, stimulated, the children are left isolated in their cots or not interacting with other people, they do not grow well physically. We know that. We know that repeated infections can take a toll on physical growth. And we know, of course, that food is necessary for good growth. Here is an example of a healthy individual, really a healthy infant, and a stunted child. I don't think I think it's quite easy to see which is which. The healthy girl who looks healthy, looks attentive, is dressed better than the stunted individual. She is only 2 years and 2 months old, and she's just below the 50th percentile, or this zero line. Zero means right in the middle of the height distribution for her age and for her sex. So she's right on target. But the other girl, who has not only some damage to her knee with a plaster, but just that look of misery on her face, this is her height. This is height in centimeters. She's the same height as the 2-year-old, 2-month-year-old girl, but this girl is 4 years old and 4 months. So, in fact, she's a little bit shorter. So she's more than 3 standard deviations below the median or average height of girls at that age. Anything below -2 is considered stunted by the World Health Organization and most nutritional epidemiologists. So this is very clear. There's something wrong with the growth of this girl. And it could be due to poor nutrition, could be repeated infection, could be inadequate psychosocial stimulation, but it could be other things as well. Worldwide, you see in this map the distribution of children who are stunted. That is, children who are below that -2 standard deviations for their age and for their sex. So most of the countries with stunting are in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, in Yemen, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of Indonesia, India. The one country that is in the red in the Americas is Guatemala, which is this smallish country that borders on Mexico, Belize, and other Central American countries. So Guatemala has special interest for us because of the high prevalence of stunting for the Americas. Even more curious about stunting and about Guatemala is that when we look at the demographic and health surveys, which are conducted periodically in countries around the world, I'm not going to go into the details of how these surveys are conducted, but representative samples, usually of mothers and their infants and children, are interviewed. The mothers and the infants and children are measured, and observations or questionnaires are given about living conditions, especially the wealth of the household. And the demographic and health surveys measure wealth, not in terms of money, but in terms of home construction. Is there the sanitary, what are the sanitary facilities in the home? Are they good quality, poor quality? And other questions about material items in the home, refrigerators and other electrical appliances like that. And so they divide the people who are surveyed into 5 categories, from the poorest to the richest. Now, these are not Bill and Melinda Gates' richest, but it could include those people, but these are the relatively the wealthiest people for a low income or middle income country. So of course, to be poor in Guatemala is to be very, very poor compared with, let's say, United States or Great Britain. To be rich in Guatemala can be as rich as anyone in the United States or Great Britain or Portugal, but it doesn't, richest doesn't always mean super wealthy, not millionaires or billionaires. However, these are people with significant economic and material resources. But what you see here is that stunting in these 5 nations, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Guatemala, in these years when the demographic and health survey was conducted, The poorest and the poor have very high prevalence of stunting, 60%, close to 70% in Guatemala. 66% of the poorest households have infants and children. These are between birth and 5 years of age. Up to 66% are stunted. In the poor category, 57% in Guatemala. In the middle income category, 44%. But in the rich, 29%. And in the richest category in Guatemala, 17%. In Pakistan, 27.5% of the richest infants and children under 5 years of age are stunted. There should not be any infants and children stunted in this richest category, or less than 1%. For the entire United States, for the entire United Kingdom, less than 3% of the entire population is stunted. On a purely statistical basis, given a -2 standard deviations of a growth reference, should be 2.3% could be stunted, you would expect. In the United States, it's less than 1%. In Guatemala, we'll see later, again, that even some of the super rich are 3 to 5% stunting. So that is unexpected. Okay, the odds ratio for stunting is 2 to 3 times higher for the wealth index, from poorest to richest, than for diet diversity score, something else that the demographic and health surveys measure, or mother's education, which is also measured. So it's something about wealth. It's not money in your pocket, but it's about the resources that the family has, the security that the family has. And there should be, as I said, almost no stunting in this richest category, yet in these are lower middle income countries. These are not the poorest countries in the world, yet there is 12% up to 27.5%. In Guatemala, it's 17%. Okay, Guatemala in the year 2020 had an estimated population of almost 18 million people. That's only 0.23% of the world's population. Okay, Guatemala is not a very big country. It is not super populous, but it's an important country because of what it tells us about human suffering. 23% of the population in Guatemala suffers from food insecurity. Food insecurity means you're not sure where food is coming and what kind of food you might have. Doesn't mean you don't eat. In fact, a curious thing about food insecurity is that many people suffering from food insecurity tend to be overweight or obese. It's not that they don't eat. Their diet is probably monotonous. It is not well balanced, and people may eat when food is available because they don't know when food will not be available. They may overeat, and also the frustration of suffering from the uncertainty of when food will be available, what type of food will be available, can cause people to overeat and perhaps under exercise due to depression and other psychological pathology from that food insecurity. The food insecurity is higher in rural areas and highest in the indigenous Maya regions. Guatemala is a country of several ethnic groups, but the two dominant ethnic groups are the Maya people, who are the descendants, the bio and social cultural descendants of the people who inhabited what today is southern Mexico and Central America before Europeans arrived in the year approximately 1500. During the Conquista. And the other major ethnic group in Guatemala called themselves Ladinos. Ladinos and Maya may share many genetic traits, but Maya identify as Maya, may speak a Maya language, wear Maya type clothing, eat Maya style foods, practice Maya religions, and other ethnically identifiable Maya behaviors. whereas Latinos will tend to dress more in Western style clothing, as you see here, practice some form of European religion, some form of Christianity, at first Catholicism, but much more recently, of course, various kinds of evangelical Protestant faiths. Anyway, all the poor in Guatemala suffer from food insecurity. The Maya suffer even more. An article in one of the Guatemala newspapers had this headline, Hay dos Guatemalas. I don't have to translate for this audience. And this is the one that doesn't eat. So there's the poor suffer food insecurity. There has been 500 years since the Conquista, 500 years of violence and insecurity. Maya and Latinos still tell stories of the conquest. Stories of the conquest are still reenacted in Maya dances and rituals at various times during the year. People remember this even today, more than 500 years after Spanish arrived, and Portuguese as well, arrived in Central America and Mexico. Today, this is a year 2020 update. How safe is Guatemala for travel? Guatemala is not the safest country to visit. It has extremely high crime rates of both violent and petty crime. This is advice for tourists. You should be vigilant and take all possible precaution measures in order to minimize the risk of something happening. So there's lots of petty crime, but as we'll see in a bit, Guatemala is unsafe for Guatemalans, not just for tourists. It's even more unsafe for Guatemalans, especially women. Girls and women have tremendous insecurity in Guatemala. Here are some Maya women. As I said, Maya identify ethnically in part through wearing Maya-style clothing, especially the women. These are Achi women who in 2019 were protesting against war crimes in Guatemala. I'll talk about the civil war in Guatemala in a moment. But the civil war is officially over, but the after effects of the civil war still reverberate throughout Guatemala. So they are protesting against war crimes, mostly massacres that occurred in many Maya villages. This man, who is now dead, was the dictator of Guatemala, General Jose Efrain Rios Montt. It says he's wanted, se busca, for genocide. These pictures are pictures of people who were murdered during the time that Rios Montt was the head of state of Guatemala, which was only for 2 years, 1982-83. But during that time, some of the worst massacres took place in Maya villages in Guatemala. The military forces of Rios Montt tried to exterminate the Ixil Maya in the northwest of the country, most of whose villages were either wiped out or transformed into basically concentration camps by the Guatemalan military. It's very clear from the reconciliation and truth commissions that have taken place since the Civil War that 90% or so of the atrocities in Guatemala were committed by the military. The genocide campaign forced the Maya and poor Latinos to migrate to Mexico and then to the United States. I don't think I talk about my work with Maya in the United States, but I may mention them briefly later. This is a photograph of Guatemalan military forces, the elite shock troop forces known as Cabiles. They are the special forces. In testimony by former Kabyle soldiers, officers, to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of the United Nations and other groups, they ordered us to kill all the people. So this is not a secret. Everyone knows this took place. Some of these trials took place in the United States. I have to say, I am a United States citizen. I am embarrassed and shamed that my government paid for the training of these Cabiles and the training of Guatemalan military officers throughout the period of the Civil War. That was from 1960 to 1996, 36 years of official civil war. The United States helped support and supply and arm the Guatemalan military. So I'm not, as I said, I'm ashamed of that for my country. Each one of these packages, 54, 53, 52, each package was a person. These are skeletons and other remains excavated from mass graves in Guatemala villages after the Kabyles and other armed forces exterminated, raped, tortured, killed everybody, children, old people, not just men. The village of Dos Eres was one of the worst. 300 people were killed, including 113, that's not here, infants and children. Everybody was massacred in that village. Okay, the Civil War ended in 1996 officially. Peace treaties were signed. The peace treaties required that there be open and free elections for the president of Guatemala and for other officials of the government. According to every external observer of Guatemala, political observer, there has never really been a free and open election. This man was elected president in 2016. His name is Jimmy Morales. Prior to being president, he was a comedian and TV entertainer. He often appeared on television with his face blackened and with an Afro-style wig as a character named Black Bataya, and he would speak in an infantile voice and tell self-deprecating jokes. It's the worst kind of form of racism that could still exist today. And this man made a living doing that. He basically has said there were no massacres in Guatemala. He expelled all of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. He expelled the United Nations anti-corruption commissions, mostly because they were investigating Senor Morales and his family. During the administration of Morales, the Guatemalan Postal Service completely shut down. That's because the previous president and vice president had been using the Postal Service for money laundering and drug business, things like that. So for several years, the Postal Service ended in Guatemala. The New York Times in 2019 said Morales is the president against democracy. The expulsion of Anti-Corruption Commission was a clear way to have more corruption with impunity. So Morales' family is well connected with all of the worst political forces in Guatemala and connected with the military. Morales' son and brother were accused of corruption. What Morales did was get rid of the commission that accused them, and no one has gone to jail. The previous president and vice president are in custody. The vice president, who before being vice president, she was Guatemala's beauty queen. She is in jail, as far as I know, still in jail. The former president is awaiting trial, but it's likely he never will come to trial because Morales and the current president have gotten rid of all of the accusers. This is the current president of Guatemala, Alejandro Giammattei. He won by disqualification of all the other candidates. So essentially, he was not really elected. He was the only one left standing. He was briefly the head of the country's prisons before he was president of Guatemala. But that term as head of the country's prison ended when Giammattei was put in jail because he was accused of 7 murders of inmates in Guatemalan prisons. But all those charges were dropped. He's a free man. He is the president of Guatemala. And just yesterday, the United States Vice President, Kamala Harris, met with the president of Guatemala. She's visiting Guatemala in order to form a new anti-corruption task force. And these This is a quote of Vice President Harris. "We must root out corruption wherever it exists. It erodes the confidence of the people, the confidence that the people have in their government and its leaders." I wish her very good luck. GMATI is his party opposed the peace treaties that were signed in 1996. His political party is totally composed of people who want to extract natural resources from Guatemala. These are companies in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere. They are taking land by force, by murder, by intimidation from the people of Guatemala to extract the mineral resources to be used in Europe and North America. So this man is supporting that right now. He said, "No one has ever accused me of corruption." No, you've just been accused of murder, but not corruption. Okay. What's the situation in Guatemala more generally? Over 40% of the population is Maya. That's an official figure. I would say that more than 60% of the population is Maya, but it's very difficult to tell who is a Maya sometimes. Some people don't want to be considered Maya because of discrimination and bias against Maya. 75% of those people who say they are Maya live in poverty. Poverty means less than $5 per day. Many people live in extreme poverty, less than $2 per day for the family. And some are even worse off than that. Guatemala ranks third lowest, third worst on the Gender Inequality Index. Women in Guatemala of any ethnicity and any socioeconomic status, women suffer more than men. Guatemala has the third highest rate of violent deaths for women. That was at the time this was written. I think Guatemala has moved to fourth place, but you don't want to be in fourth place or third place for violent deaths to women. I'll talk more about that later. By age 15, most Maya girls, teenagers, have dropped out of school or left school or been forced out of school. And by 18, 40% are married. Education, longer time in school, is one of the most powerful predictors of health and well-being for the girl or for anybody, and for her infants and children, for her family. So the fact that many leave school well before age 15. A study we did in one Maya village very close to Guatemala City showed that no girls were in the last year of primary school, in year 6. No girls. So no girls even finished primary school, at least in the 2 years that I was working in that village. And early marriage is another way to marginalize and repress the role of women in society, because of course, by the time they're married or soon after, they're having babies. The Union Bank of Switzerland and the consultancy firm WealthX, whose headquarters are in Singapore, these are Switzerland and Singapore are two of the wealthiest places in the world. These wealth firms report that 260 people in Guatemala, 260 individuals in Guatemala possess the accumulated wealth of $30 billion. That's 56% of the annual economy of Guatemala. In other words, 0.001% of Guatemalans have more capital than the rest of all of Guatemala. That's how unequal the society is. This is how most live. This is after one of the recent hurricanes that destroyed people's homes, took off their roofs, ruined their possessions, and only increases their insecurity for food, for health care, for education, for everything. So, statistically, we can put Guatemala here. It is number 125 out of 187 countries on the United Nations Human Development Index, The Human Development Index is a combination of well-being factors, education, medical care, some other things that says, well, what's the quality of life in a country? Guatemala ranks 125 out of 187. India ranks 131. The United States ranks 5th, just to give you an idea. Norway is 1st. Guatemala is the 2nd most unequal country in the world on this Gini index. The Gini index, if only one person had all the wealth and everybody else had nothing, you would have a Gini of 1. If you have a Gini of 0, then everybody has exactly the same amount of wealth, or really income distribution. So Norway ranks very low. No country is 0. There's always inequality in money. Norway is 26. Guatemala is 56. Only the Central African Republic is worst at 56.3. So Guatemala 56 is not much better. Guatemala is the 2nd most unequally unequal country in the world, if I said that right. 2nd worst for the Gini index. Okay, I've been part of a study of child and adolescent development in Guatemala since I first went to Guatemala in 1974. This study was started by a man named Robert McVeigh, a United States citizen who moved to Guatemala and became the head teacher of the American School of Guatemala and eventually the vice rector of a private university in Guatemala called the Universidad del Valle de Guatemala. Mr. McVeigh started the study in 1953, and the study continued until 1999. Every year, a team of people from the American School of the university went to several schools in and near Guatemala City and measured all of the children at those schools. It's not representative of the entire country of Guatemala, but it does give us an idea of different social and economic levels in and around Guatemala City. So here they are measuring height, as you see there, measuring grip strength of the hand, measuring weight, and several other measurements were taken. Two schools, this is actually the campus of the American School of Guatemala, is very high SES, and 2 private Catholic schools affiliated with Catholic Church formed what we call School 2. They were basically of high socioeconomic status, and all of these schools are Latinos. If there are any Maya at these schools, very, very, very few. So these represent families of very high wealth. 2 schools were of low SES. School 3 was a school private in that it charged a very small fee, but most of the families came from a low income area of Guatemala City. School 4 was a state school. Both of these are Ladino, and this is the state school, as you see here. You can compare it with the just one area of the American School of Guatemala. It's called the American School. Most of the students are not from the United States. They are from Guatemala. Anyway, this school is in the center of Guatemala City. It's very low income. Children actually only attended a couple hours a day at this school, either in the morning or the afternoon, whereas this is a private, very well-appointed school. There was also, this is the neighborhood where many of the children attending School 4 lived. No running water to the homes. Children would have to go to this public water source, carry water. You can see them in various, this child is not even completely dressed. Sanitary facilities were very poor in this neighborhood. The School 5 was added to the study in 1979. And it was a very low socioeconomic status Maya school. We assess socioeconomic status based on the education and occupation of the parents of the school students. We sense surveys, or we went ourselves home to home and asked people how many years of education they had and what were their jobs. And then we ranked those jobs or occupations on the international scale of occupations. This is a photograph I took in 1980s of this Maya school. This is one from their Facebook page today. The school is in better shape today. The entire village is in better shape than it was in the 1980s. But I can tell you that when we went to the school in the 1980s, the average height of these boys and girls was minus 1.5 standard deviations below the average height for boys and girls their ages. And 20 years later, their average height for age and sex was minus 1.4. So it really didn't change in 20 years, despite the fact that the village has better sanitation, perhaps a better supply of food, better medical care than it did in the 1970s and 1980s. So just giving more food and just giving more medical care does not make kids taller, at least not in a country like Guatemala. Here, in fact, school 1, the wealthiest school, school 5, the poorest school, the total number of children we measured over a 20-year period, this is 79 to 99. One thing to note is there are fewer girls at all SES levels. Even at the richest school, 52% of the students were boys and 48% were girls. Not a big difference. When you get to some of the other schools, 56% versus 44, 57% versus 43. And as I said, in school 5, very few girls would even finish the primary school. Okay, this is what stunting looked like at the first time a boy or a girl was measured. In school 5, which I just said, actually back in overall it was minus 2.1 at age of entry into school, the first time they were measured at the school. In school 4, Ladino low socioeconomic, minus 1.7. School 3, a little higher SES, but still low SES, minus 1.4. School 2 and school 1 are the wealthy families, and you have minus 0.5 standard deviations in height, minus 0.2. What that means is 3% of the boys and girls at school 1 were stunted when they first entered school. It should be less than 1%. And 5% were stunted at school 2. It's not a poor school by any imagination. So again, it should be less than 1%. Okay, why all this stunting? Especially when we see that in the Maya village, we know they received over 20 years more sanitation, infrastructure, perhaps better food, perhaps better medical care. Guatemala is a dangerous place, as I said earlier, the 4th highest murder rate in the world. So we're looking at a online group called Insecurity that has worldwide statistics, and Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela are the worst countries in Latin America for murder rates. And also, as it says here, very high extortion rates. Extortion, including kidnapping, super high in Guatemala. There are gangs in Guatemala. One of them is called Barrio 18. It's one of the largest youth gangs in the Western Hemisphere. It has subdivisions in Canada and the United States. Its better known rival gang is called MS-13 or Mara Salvatrucha. They operate with impunity throughout the Americas. And they are very scary people, not just because of their facial tattoos, but what they do to people. Guatemala's criminal organizations are super sophisticated and dangerous. Some have been in operations for decades, and they include people with professional training in the military, from intelligence agencies and active members of the police work for the gangs. Of course, you know all this about Mexican drug cartels, but it's going on in Guatemala as well. Guatemala is one of the kidnapping hotspots of the world. Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Venezuela, Nigeria, India, Pakistan, right? All those countries that are where the wealthiest families have 17 to 26% stunting amongst their infants and children, have very high insecurity rates due to kidnappings. Of course, wealthy people are targets of kidnappings because wealthy people can pay. But even the poor are kidnapped. I don't have the most recent data for Guatemala, and maybe Noel Solomons can tell me what's going on. I can't find data more recent than 2015 when there was a surge in kidnappings in Guatemala. I know people from the research team in Guatemala who have had family members kidnapped more than once. Fortunately, their family members were returned alive, but they had to pay ransoms. At the American school, the children come to school driven by chauffeurs, armed chauffeurs, chauffeurs with guns in bulletproof Mercedes-Benz and other cars. The chauffeurs take them into a fenced-in, protected car park areas where they are escorted to school under the watchful eye of school security because of the threat of kidnapping. There are at least 8 kidnapping gangs operating in Guatemala as of February 2020. Most of them are highly trained. The kidnappers are from the national police, and this is well known, but little is done about it. Those who can afford it, the super wealthy, have bulletproof cars and armed guards, and have armed guards at their doors and their businesses. This is a typical sight to see in Guatemala. For people from the UK, this would seem very scary, but for most Guatemalans, this is a sign of security, an armed guard. But the poor don't have the money for armed guards, but they still suffer from violence and kidnapping. These are 2 mothers carrying pictures of their sons who were kidnapped and killed in San Juan, Zacatepec in 2017. Why they were kidnapped, I'm not sure. Usually it is some kind of vengeance or retribution, perhaps related to gang activity, perhaps something that the kidnappers had against the families. It doesn't matter. You can kill somebody because you just don't like them. Your girlfriend says something you don't like, you can kill her. Only 1% of murders of women in Guatemala ever have any prosecution of the murderer. So you can kill with impunity, and everybody suffers. That's why I opened this talk with a woman from a rural Maya village saying, we just want to live in peace and security from violence. When you live with violence every day, from the time you are a fetus developing in your mother's womb till the end of your life, you are suffering from adverse experiences. A lot of people are looking at how adverse childhood experiences influences the way infants and children grow up and develop, physically, emotionally. We know that these ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, include things like physical and emotional abuse, neglect, caregiver, mental illness, household violence. But if you live in a country like Guatemala, you're exposed to violence at a systematic societal level, not just in your family. The more ACEs a child experiences, the more likely she is to suffer from things like heart disease and diabetes, poor school performance, substance abuse, is more likely to earn less money. Everything will suffer later in life. And researchers looking at these ACEs. Just count the number of adverse childhood experiences, and you see a perfect linear relationship between greater number of adverse experiences and more of these biomedical, sociological, educational pathologies later in life. These ACEs produce what is called toxic stress. We have good stress, but these produce bad, toxic, poisonous stress. Experiencing things like racism, community violence, causes this toxic stress. And this excess activation of a stress response system in the body leads to long-lasting wear and tear on the body. So day after day, hour after hour, you're experiencing food insecurity, educational insecurity, medical insecurity, risk of kidnapping, risk of physical violence if you're a woman or a man. Eventually, the acute stress response, which might be good in the short term, becomes the chronic stress response, and that destroys your body. The effect, it says here, is similar to constantly keeping your foot on the accelerator in your automobile, revving the car engine for days and weeks at a time. Sooner or later, the car engine will fail. We know that stress influences the way the children grows. This has been known for a long time, for over, really it goes back to the year 1300 or so, when the first written documents are known that showed that children who suffered isolation and physical abuse were much smaller than children who didn't suffer. We now know how it works through the factors that influence insulin-like growth factor 1. As it says, it's a growth factor. Insulin-like growth factor 1 is the most powerful growth promoter in the body. Overall growth, cell division, cell enlargement, growth of the skeleton. Anything in red here, if you suffer from malnutrition or infection, immune system stimulation, that takes away from IGF-1, estrogens. Overexposure to estrogens lower IGF-1. Other hormones, insulin, thyroid, androgens, raise IGF-1. There's a genetic component, but that's more or less the same for everybody. Growth hormone, which is coming from the hypothalamus in the brain, and appropriate exercise stimulates IGF-1 production. Acute stress, a short-term stress, actually increases growth hormone and then IGF-1. That's short-term stress, and it could be good stress, like, you're getting married today. That's a good stress. But chronic toxic stress lowers growth hormone and lowers IGF-1 and results in delayed growth or growth cessation. We know this today from children who have been tied to their cots, like Romanian orphans under the Ceausescu regime 20 years ago. Colleagues of mine are still studying the adults who survived that suffering. We know it from many infants and children who suffer what is called a kind of spontaneous growth delay or retardation that has no known organic cause, no nutritional or medical cause. If you take them out of the environment in which they're living, a stressful home, they usually start growing right away. We know it from studies of children who were suffering during World War I, in Germany during World War I, when they were removed from the war zone, taken to Switzerland to summer camps. The first thing they did was they started growing, even before they started eating. They started growing so fast, they had to feed them more food to support their growth, but they just spontaneously started growing. It was an emotional stress that stopped their growth. We know today from research about the prolonged activation of the acute stress response, how this works. Toxic stresses increase the production of stress hormones like cortisol, catecholamines such as dopamine, and these others, norepinephrine, adrenaline, so forth, and other hormones. In the short term, this can be good. So in a short-term stress can help you run away fast if you're being chased by a predator, or if a bus is coming at you when you're crossing the street, or if you're suffering from an acute infection. An acute stress response can increase your immune system and help you fight off that infection. But prolonged toxic, well, even the acute stress response results in the release of this hormone, osteocalcin. Osteocalcin comes from only one place, and that is from osteoblasts. Those are bone-forming cells in the skeleton. They're released into the bloodstream, and osteocalcin is necessary in order to maintain this acute stress response. But if that acute stress response is maintained day after day after day from toxic chronic stress, you enter a hypermetabolic state where you break down body cells constantly to liberate amino acids, fatty acids, glucose, as if it's, as if you're preparing for acute stress, but in fact, it is taking away all this tissue from bone and putting it into the bloodstream, and bones stop growing. Yet the same liberation of fatty acids and glucose into the bloodstream, when all that extra fatty acids and glucose have nowhere to go because you've liberated everything you have from your body reserves, the excess energy in the fatty acids and in the glucose gets stored as fat. So you stop growing in height, you're short in stature, but you gain weight. And this is what we see in these highly insecure, violent, stressful, and usually lower or middle income countries around the world. It's often called the nutritional dual burden of being stunted but overweight. But it probably is not nutritional. It is probably emotional. It is a permanent loss of bone tissue with adipose deposition. It is the stress dual response, not nutritional. Okay. Bad stress, good stress, love and hope, these emotions which are lacking in countries with such high rates of insecurity and violence, like Guatemala. Infants and children need love and hope. All these come from what I call SEPE factors. That's social, economic, political, and emotional resources that people have. We've talked about socioeconomic status, but SEPE is more comprehensive. It includes the social and the economic, but it gets into the political, not just who's president, but who has power, who is powerless, who has no hope. Do you have real love, the kind of love that comes from security, the kind of security parents? If you don't have that kind of security, you really don't have all aspects of love, and you will suffer. So I've been writing and talking about SEPE factors a bit in things that I'm writing, including the article that this talk is based on. I don't know, do I have time? Just to show you how SEPE, social, economic, political, and emotional factors influence growth. When I was a student, I learned that everybody had a target they would grow to, which was mostly genetically determined. The genes your parents pass on to you would determine what was your growth potential. So your growth was aimed towards this target. If you didn't hit the target, it's because something went wrong. You may have suffered from a genetic disease, or you may have suffered from poor nutrition, or the infection, or lack of psychosocial stimulation. But growth was supposed to proceed from fertilization right towards this target if everything was working well. But today, we no longer talk about a target. At least I don't talk about a target. I talk about this large, tall, and wide frame. And different sepe factors have some influence on where your growth goes on this frame. Just because you have good social factors or good economic factors doesn't mean you will be very tall. As we saw, 17% of the wealthiest families in Guatemala have a stunted infant or child. So it's more complicated. We grow, instead of along a simple trajectory, like an arrow flying towards its target, we grow along a more complicated path through different lenses. We pass through different lenses of biocultural plasticity. I'm not going to talk more about it, but the point is that emotional factors are a very important part of that biocultural plasticity. So you can read more about this in my new book, which was published at the end of last year. And you can find it both in ebook and print. And you can read excerpts at these websites, the Cambridge University Press website. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions or comments.
I don't know if anyone has questions to do.
I have a question. Hi.
Okay.
So Barry, I of course I don't know Guatemala, but I just wonder to understand the historical problem with this country. Is that because they have resources that you talk about? What resources are there? The negative history that this country have. What's the main reason? Is
the main reason? I didn't hear one part. The main reason for what?
For this negative story of Guatemala. I don't know Guatemala, but
what's the problem in Guatemala? It's as I said, it's 500 plus years of violence, insecurity,
yes,
and racism. The Maya, when the Spanish arrived, it's estimated that in all of the Americas there were 90 million people in all of the Americas, from Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, several million in Central America and Mexico. And by the year 1600, 100 years later, 90% of those people were dead. That was mostly from infectious disease, but also from fear and violence that were used to intimidate and conquer the Native American populations. So you begin with that. That's the beginning of the problem, was the conquest. And the Spanish may not have known they were bringing infectious diseases that would kill millions and millions of people, that were not killers in Spain, like measles and plague. I mean, there were killers, but they weren't. They didn't kill everybody. But in a new environment, everybody became ill at the same time, and whole villages and whole communities died simultaneously because there was no one to provide any care. So you begin with that fear and insecurity. There were at least 8 major epidemics. I mean, we're in a time of pandemic. There were 8 major epidemics in the first 100 years. Thousands and thousands of people died in each one, right in front of your eyes. So if you survived, you lived in this terrible fear. Remember, no one knew what caused these diseases. So you could blame the gods, you could blame magic, you could blame anything, but people lived in fear. And since then, the fear has continued. So when people live in fear and people don't have any hope for the future, that's a chronic toxic stress that produces these stress hormones that stop bone growth and keep people from growing taller.
Barry, yes, but that happened in other countries in South America, such as Mexico, also in Brazil with the Portuguese and the other countries. So my questions, they're not seeing such bad conditions like Guatemala people are. So my question is, why Guatemala are so different from the other ones? That's why I was asking, what is the big problem?
In addition to all of the fear and toxic stress, of course, there is tremendous poverty. As I said, Guatemala is the most economically unequal country in the Americas and the second most unequal in the world. So before we even talk about stress, we could talk about the stunting that is due to poverty, to infection, from poor sanitation, to poor diets. But the fact that the wealthiest in Guatemala, 17% of the wealthiest infants and children are stunted, indicates that at least 17% of all the stunting in Guatemala is probably due to non-nutritional, non-infectious disease causes. It could be that some of those wealthiest families do not feed their children well, or the children are ill, of course. But what I'm trying to say is that we should consider these other factors as being synergistic, actively interacting with what we consider to be the primary causes of poor growth. Many people think you just have to give people some more food. Many stunting interventions, what we call them sprinkle studies. They just sprinkle some vitamins or minerals on the people. They give them a supplement, but they don't get bigger. They don't get bigger. They get fatter sometimes. In fact, some of the supplement interventions, these are studies that cost millions of euros. We're not talking about insignificant research. Some of the supplement studies have actually, the people receiving the nutritional supplement were shorter at the end. So it's clearly not just nutritional. But the nutrition community sometimes thinks all you have to do is do nutrition, or the water and sanitation community thinks all you have to do is water and sanitation, but it's a much bigger package. And until you have some kind of equality and some kind of security, you don't have good growth. It's what we see in Europe. It's what we see in Europe. The tallest countries, the tallest people in the world are Europeans, Northwest Europeans, from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Northern Germany. 120 years ago, many of them were the same size as Guatemalans. Poor Guatemalans today, 120 years ago. What happened? Democracy happened. Revolution happened. People had hope for the future. There was a decrease of inequality. Of course, there's still inequality in the Netherlands and in Denmark. There's still inequality, but you know what they do in those countries? In those very rich countries, and I should say those very tall countries, every year, the amount of taxes that people pay is published in the newspaper. And if you're considered very rich, but you're not paying enough taxes, you are publicly shamed. So people actually want to make sure that to show that I am the richest, I want to pay the most taxes. It helps equalize the country. But in Guatemala, you cannot get people to even file a tax return. Of all the money that is produced by the economy of Guatemala, the government gets less than 10% in taxes. You cannot have a successful country, a healthy country. That's 10% for everything. not just healthcare, but the military, everything. So Dr. Solomons, please say something.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, okay. Can you see me? No. I have my camera is just on. Anyway, if you can hear me, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. I
Yeah,
can
I
hear
can
you.
hear and see you.
Yes.
Okay, I can't see me, but I'm happy to be heard and seen. What I do want to comment on is, and reinforce in your message, is that what is traditionally called chronic malnutrition is often not chronic. It happens very early in life, even at the time of birth, and it's really not primarily nutritionally based. I believe it is based on stresses. Barry has cataloged some of the stresses. I've been more interested during my lifetime in the infectious disease, tropical medicine, tropical environmental stresses, but they still follow that wonderful common pathway shown with the liver and all of the red stimuli and arrows and the green ones, except for the gallbladder, which is also green. I thought that was cute. And it is in the legs. It is really in the legs. And Barry, your illustration of the two young girls of 4.4 and 2.2 is wonderful, because if you look very carefully, the trunk and head of the stunted girl is actually longer, as it should be, than that of the 2-year-old girl, but her legs are so much shorter that they make her lower than someone who doesn't even have the trunk length that she does. So if there were anyone who doubted that the attack on the growth of the legs is a major factor, that particular slide, look at it carefully. Her belt is below the belt of the other girl. She has a longer trunk, but extraordinary shorter legs for someone who's half the age of the other one.
Right.
So yes, the mechanism of getting shorter is the accumulation of stress. Where Barry and I sometimes differ, and I guess we'll lay out the dirty laundry in this public, is that I believe that the Mayan ethnicity, the Mayan gene set, is also synergistic with these adverse effects, because they are, if you separate them as a group, the shortest people in the world by far, both men and women. And the Latinos, the European ancestry people, are exposed to pretty much the same ecology, the same violence, the same stress, and so forth, but they don't respond with the same shortening. So I think that there is a Mayan factor. The Mayans encountering the stress equals more profound shortening than other racial groups. It may also be true in Timor-Leste, Yemen, Afghanistan, the other places in the world where profound stunting, almost equivalent, or sometimes even worse than Guatemala, occurs. That's what I have to say.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions, Professor.
Yeah.
The first one is about, well, in the beginning, you talk about women and girls being more, sometimes more affected by stress and the toxic stress than boys. So do you found some gender inequalities in your data? And the second question is about the government responses to the results found in this study and the previous ones. So are the governments dealing with those in some way or just ignoring it?
Our government's dealing with the problems. Guatemala has had a tremendous amount of money invested in mostly in nutrition programs. There's a research center there called the Institute of Nutrition of Central America and Panama, which has been conducting studies since the 1950s or 60s. But precious little has happened to improve the physical growth and development of the poorest people in Guatemala. That's your second question. The first question is about bias against girls and women.
Yeah.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, the data that I showed about education, girls and women have less opportunity for education, and education is probably the single most important correlate of improving your life in the future. So the more education a woman gets, a girl gets, the better things are for herself and for her children in the future. And that's still a problem in Guatemala. The violence against women, the fact that, as I said, out of every 100 murders of a woman, a girl or a woman in Guatemala, only one ever gets prosecuted. 99 murderers just walk free. Most are never even investigated by the police. So those are just two extreme examples of the place of women in society. Getting back to Dr. Solomon's, Noel's comment about genetics, we just don't know how tall Maya could be.
That's true.
We would have to have a perfectly, optimal environment for everybody.
But we know how short they can be.
We know how short they can be, yes.
And let me get back to Daniela and the gender issue, because Guatemalan women, in a recent publication by INCAP, are the shortest women in the world.
That's true.
Guatemalan men are the fourth shortest in the world. And this is including all ethnicities in Guatemala. So that's an amazing thing. And we have a study, the one in Nahuala, which I consider the shortest village, in which the women are extraordinarily, relatively more stunted than the men of their same age, their husbands, their brothers. So there is another factor not well studied, not well understood, but clearly females are suffering more from whatever makes them short early in life than men. And it's been happening. These are people who are 70 years and older.
Right.
So I would like to find out what makes women differentially more susceptible. That's how I look at it. More susceptible.
That's a good one.
Not necessarily more resistant or resilient.
Yeah. I see that Marco asked the question on the chat, which relates to this. Other countries also have had violent conquest, but aren't as bad as Guatemala. So there's something else. And that's what we're talking about, Marco. We're talking about this something else that we're not sure what it is. Is it the gender inequality? Is it perhaps something genetic? But I do know, because we've measured the children of Maya migrants to the United States. So the parents were born in rural Guatemala, and the students, we went to schools and measured boys and girls between the age of 5 and 12 years of age. These boys and girls were born either in Guatemala or born while the parents were migrating. Some were born in Mexico, or some were born in the United States. And all of them, now living in the United States, are taller than their even family members back in Guatemala. The average difference for boys and girls who have lived some time in the United States was 7 centimeters the first time I went to measure them in the 1990s. And the early 2000s, I measured them again at different boys and girls, but went back. So these had lived in the United States longer, or many were born in the United States, and it was 11 centimeters taller. Now, it's only between the ages of 5 and 12. So it's probably that 11 centimeters is probably an acceleration of growth. We don't know that they'll be 11 centimeters taller as adults, but they'll probably be 4 or 5 centimeters taller.
And 8 of those centimeters are in the legs.
In the legs, that's right. 70% is in the legs. So yeah, what you said was exactly correct. So I would like to go back and measure those boys and girls now 20 years later to see how tall they are as adults. Of course, they got better food because the United States just has more food. You can drink the water in the United States right from, you know, the tap. There's school, and there were breakfast and lunch programs for these boys and girls in their schools. They could get free breakfast and free lunch paid for by the US government. So there's all of that, but there's also the security of they weren't going to be kidnapped, they weren't going to be shot, their parents were not going to be arrested in the middle of the night and disappeared like happens in Guatemala. They still lived with insecurity, of course, because many were not documented migrants. So they could still be arrested by the migration police in the United States. Some of them were, but that is far, far less insecurity than being shot while you're sleeping or having your village burned to the ground while you're sleeping, which happens in Guatemala. So I don't have all the answers, you know. So Marco asked a good question, and you're asking good questions. What makes the Maya so short? We don't know for sure. And that's why you have to do more research. I'm retired. Hello, Marco.
Hello. If I may, I'm sorry, I have
Yes.
a bit of problem here with my camera.
No problem.
And I'm not used to speak English very often. I read and listen English every day, even in sleep, but to speak in English is very, very rare. Because I have a personal and familiar experience with South American. I have familiars, I have relatives, relatives that live in Brazil, and I have relatives that live in Venezuela. And those countries are known for the same problems in Guatemala. They are violent countries. In Venezuela, for instance, I have relatives that they have to deal with murderers every day, homicides, kidnappings, and so on. So Honduras, for instance, is another example that I know very well, and they are the same social problems that in Guatemala, the same, with the crime rates very high, homicide rates. So the social factors, for me, I'm a biologist, so I have very difficult to accept that social factors has such weight in those data. There must be something else, of course. Mexico, for instance, Mexico is the United States know very well the regions near borders of the United States. They are very violent because the gangs, of course, and the drug gangs, for instance, the cartels. So, but don't have the same biological problems. That is a conundrum for me. Why only Guatemala has that problem? Because social factors is the same. So I agree with Dr. Sullivan when he said the biology factors must have a strong relation with genetics and other things. I don't know. I am tend to believe that they are something else, not only in the SEPE, but something else. I don't know. It is far-fetched, but it's my conviction.
It's not far-fetched at all.
Let me clarify my name. It's Solomon's, not Sullivan.
Sullivan's. I'm sorry. Solomon's. Of course. I'm
Right.
sorry. I understand Sullivan. Okay.
That's because you were listening to a guy from Philadelphia.
Oh.
Yeah.
For instance, the United States has it not what I am saying. It's not offensive. It's public. It has and high crime rates also.
Yes.
For instance, it's the Western country with the biggest homicide rate.
Correct.
Compared with Europe and things like that. And so don't have, and you are talking in the United States, for instance, now it's a very fearful environment in schools because the shootings that are happening there. So children there in the United States, they must suffer from stress. The young people in the United States, they don't know if when they are going to high school, what will happen if someone crazy enter in school and starts shooting. So they are some chronic stress in the United States, for instance. They are a very strong stress in the social area, but we don't see that it's the same index values.
Yeah, let me just put Guatemala in a context here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading from the article that I've written about this topic, which is now, it's in press with the American Journal of Human Biology. So I'm reading, between 1991 and 2001, the murder rate for Guatemalan women was about 200 murders per year. The number of killings of women tripled to 600 per year by 2006. And in 2018, it was 755. So there's been a sharp increase in murders. So how does this compare? The intentional homicide rate for Guatemalan women is 7.6 per 100,000 population. 7.6 women out of every 100,000, intentional homicide. In Afghanistan, it is 0.8 per 100,000 women. We think of Afghanistan as very violent. For the United States, it is 2.2. Guatemala is 7.6. The United States is only 2.2. For Germany, it's 0.9. So that it shows Guatemala is, you have to think statistically. You might say 7.6 is not so much bigger than 2.2, but statistically it is, 4 times more murders, 4 times more likely for a woman to be murdered in Guatemala than the United States.
But these are relatively recent stresses. Murder was not in fashion in the 1950s.
That's true.
There's a wonderful graph that I don't have, but my friends have it, of stunting rates over the years in the original 6 countries of income. You've seen it. And
right.
Costa Rica had a higher rate of stunting than Guatemala.
That's right.
When they started. And so all of the countries, Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, Panama, Togo, they've all fallen down, and Guatemala has not, which is the other reason which I feel very much with the Mayan residual, that something ethnic has retained what was all blended stunting in these more European ethnic groups. But whatever has been released over the course of the last 70 years has produced a marked fall in stunting and conversely an increase in linear growth. But Guatemala is unique in not having.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important.
It is. Whether it's something in the biology of Maya or the fact that Guatemala is the only country where first, there are many different kinds of Maya people in Guatemala, 20 officially recognized Maya languages that are mutually unintelligible. So there's not just one kind of Maya, but being Maya makes you the undesired type in terms of national policies in Guatemala. So Guatemala is the only country in Latin America where an ethnic group makes up such a large percentage of the population, and it's so easy to target because it's so easy to identify someone who is Maya. So it's some combination of biological and social, cultural, political factors.
You want to tell the people why there are no Maya in the south of Guatemala? It's not because they weren't there originally.
No, they were killed.
They were exterminated. And
Yeah.
Guatemalan Mayans are the survivors. They're the ones that had a large enough critical mass to survive the conquista.
Yeah.
But Costa Rica has no Indians because they killed their Indians like the United States did in terms of extermination.
I have colleagues, in addition to Noel, I have colleagues, and we're working on hypotheses related to community effects. As being part of a community has many kinds of biosocial, psychological factors that influences growth. So even in Switzerland, over the course of the last 120 years, because the Swiss measure all their young men for military conscription, about 90% of all the men in Switzerland have been measured since the year 1880. And back in 1880, the French speakers were the tallest. Today, the German speakers are the tallest. And exactly what has happened is that back in the late 19th century, the French speakers were the dominant social political force in Switzerland. Today, the German speakers are. So who has the power? Who is in charge? Who has the higher prestige has some effect on physical growth. We see that with the aristocracy in the world, around the world. The aristocracy are always, not every individual, but on average, are always taller than even the the bourgeoisie, or the and certainly the commoners. Even in the UK today, just look at the royal family of the UK and get their heights, which are probably on Wikipedia. So
did you compare the data with the African countries?
African.
The same data. The African countries have the same problems. So
That's right.
why there are not the same index that in Guatemala? Did you have a comprehensive study of that?
Yes.
So what conclusions did you get?
On average, African origin individuals are taller. The tallest people of African descent are African Americans, not people in Africa. I hope Noel Solomons will back me up on that. In a survey that a colleague of mine did, looking at people of African descent around the world, the tallest were African Americans, a sample measured in Washington, D.C.
Well, one of the explanations for that is selective breeding during slavery.
Yeah.
So you don't have to go through the whole issue, but it's not a natural selection in the Americas, whereas in tribal groups, clans, etc., throughout Africa, and still throughout Africa, there is relatively less selective breeding. And although the alpha males and the beta males tend to produce the most gene spread, even in the clan.
If you remember my world map from like the second thing I showed, there are more countries in Africa and in Southern Asia have stunting.
Yes.
So any country that was in the red has lots of very short people. Of course, some people are very tall.
But bigger than Guatemala, bigger than in Guatemala, of course.
No, if they're if they're stunted, they're all measured against the same growth reference, the World Health Organization growth reference.
But Marco's point is the prevalences are not 70%.
No.
And anywhere else in the world, but in Mayan defined population.
That's right. Right.
Of course.
Right. But if you look at a demographic and health survey from any African country, the poorest people will be the shortest. They may be taller than Maya, but there's still this very strong association with poverty. And also the shorter countries in Africa are the more unequal and violent countries like Central African Republic.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so there are relative differences.
And they have, in Africa, they have the same gender problems.
Exactly.
They have the same, than in Guatemala. They have the same gender problems. So exactly. It is for me, what you show is mind-boggling for me.
Excellent.
It is. I am very curious about what is the answer to that particular section in Guatemala, because it is an exception, of course.
Right. I just put my email into the chat. If you send me an email, Marco, I'll be happy to send you a paper.
Okay, I thank you.
What about a temporary subscription to your ebook? That's an even better gift.
Well, yes.
Oh, yes.
If you want to spend some money, you can buy my ebook.
Of course. It's also
but when I can come to Guatemala, I will bring a copy, at least for Cristina Fadez. Probably for Daniela too.
To see it. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway.
Sorry, Professor, but you didn't put your email.
Do you see my email in the chat? Oh, I didn't send it yet. Here it is. You see it now? In the chat. Oh, that went to Christina. Excuse me. I have to send it to everyone.
Yeah, also just for Marco, because we have your email.
Yeah, I'm going to send it to everyone. It went to Christina
Okay.
for some reason. Here you go.
Yeah.
Here's it to everyone.
We got it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor. This has been mind-blowing for me too, because I know your work, but I'm not familiar with the Maya people, and I'm not working with the stunting. I'm just working with excess weight and obesity in Portugal. So, but even here, and not looking for the stress and political factors, even here, just looking for the socioeconomic, we can see the inequalities in high, but also in the obesity levels, because if we watch for overall picture in Portugal for children, we can see that in the last years, the prevalence of obesity has been declining. But if we look for different socioeconomic groups, we see that tendencies, that trend is only true for the ones in medium and high socioeconomic status, and not for the lower groups. So
yep, you should include height in your discussion about overweight and obesity.
Yeah,
it's part of BMI, but you know that I'm not a supporter of BMI overall for many. So you should take height out and look just at heights as well.
Yeah,
especially.
And we can apply these SEP factors in developed countries, like in Portugal. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm designing my postdoc. Well, it was approved by FCT. So, but I'm designing the questionnaire. So this has been very important and highlighting, because I'm starting to think about the SEP factors to use in these feature studies about health behaviors and health outcomes. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone that's been here. I think some people had to leave because we expanded the session a little more.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
It's okay.
And Christina sent me a message. She left 20 minutes ago, but she thank you very much for this participation. And thank you everyone. And it was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Good to see everyone.
Bye, Marco. Bye.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
When we have pleasure, we don't.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.